More stability. More security. More certainty. And then she said the part that mattered most. I don't want to struggle anymore. Struggle. That word didn't match my reality, but it matched hers. And that was enough. I'm not struggling, I said calmly. You are, she replied. And in that moment I realized something important. We weren't just having a disagreement. We were living in two completely different realities. Because she wasn't seeing where I was going. She was judging me based on where I appeared to be. And in her eyes, it wasn't enough. I want a divorce, she said. No hesitation. No emotion. Just decision. And the thing is, I didn't react. Not because I didn't care. But because something inside me had already accepted this long before she said it. Okay, I replied. That answer surprised her. I could see it in the way her expression shifted just slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to show that she expected something else. A reaction. Resistance. Emotion. But I gave her none of that. Because while she was making that decision, my life had already changed. She just didn't know it yet. Because earlier that same day, I had signed a deal that made everything she believed about me completely wrong. 100 acres. Prime land. Positioned perfectly for development. A deal that took years of patience, silence, and strategy. And now, was mine. But I didn't tell her. Not yet. Because this wasn't about proving her wrong. This was about understanding who she really was, before she knew who I had become. There's something unsettling about how easily people can detach once they've already made a decision in their mind. It doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't look dramatic. It's quiet. Controlled. Almost efficient. That's what I started noticing in the days that followed. Not anger. Not regret. Just distance that had already been accepted long before it was spoken out loud. After she said she wanted a divorce, nothing exploded. There were no arguments, no emotional breakdowns, no attempts to fix what was already broken. It was as if we had both stepped into a version of reality where the outcome was already agreed upon, and now we were just moving through the process of making it official. And that calmness, her calmness, told me everything. This wasn't sudden for her. This wasn't something she was struggling with. This was something she had already decided long ago. She started moving differently almost immediately. Not dramatically, not in a way that would stand out to anyone else, but enough for me to see it clearly. Her tone became more neutral. Her conversations became shorter. Her presence in the apartment felt temporary, like she was already halfway gone. And the more I observed it, the more I realized something important. She wasn't leaving emotionally anymore. She had already left. Now she was just leaving physically. I'll start looking for a place, she said casually the next morning, standing near the kitchen counter like she was talking about something ordinary. Okay, I replied. No hesitation. No emotion. Because I wasn't trying to hold on to something that had already been released. That seemed to surprise her, even if only slightly. Not enough to show openly, but enough to feel. Because people expect resistance. They expect emotion. They expect something that validates the importance of their decision. But when you don't give them that, it creates a different kind of response. Not confusion. Awareness. You're taking this very calmly, she said, watching me carefully. I looked at her for a moment, not searching for words, just choosing them. There's nothing to fight for if the decision is already made, I said. And that answer settled into the space between us like something final. Because it was. The next few days followed a pattern that didn't change. She spent more time outside, less time at home. When she was there, she moved through the space like it no longer belonged to her. Or maybe like it no longer belonged to us. There was no effort to reconnect, no attempt to revisit the conversation, no emotional residue from what had been said. Just forward movement. I noticed the details. The way she packed things gradually instead of all at once. The way she separated what was hers without asking about what was mine. The way she stopped including me in even the smallest parts of her routine. None of it was aggressive. None of it was cold. But it was complete. And in that completeness there was clarity. Because when someone leaves like that, they're not unsure. They're certain. One evening she came back earlier than usual. For a brief moment I thought something might be different. Not because I expected it, but because patterns create expectations. But as soon as she walked in, I saw it again, that same controlled distance, that same calm detachment. I spoke to a lawyer today, she said. Simple. Direct. Efficient. I nodded. Okay. They said we can make this quick if we both agree on everything. Of course. Efficiency again. Not resolution. Not understanding. Just process. That works, I said. And once again that lack of resistance created something she didn't expect. "You don't have anything to say?" she asked. "I think everything that needed to be said already has been," I replied. And that answer did something subtle but noticeable. It shifted her perspective just slightly. Not emotionally. Not deeply. But enough for her to realize that this wasn't going to unfold the way she imagined. Because in her mind, this was supposed to feel like a decision. But now, it felt like a conclusion. The following days continued the same way. She became more independent, more focused on what was next for her, more invested in a future that didn't include me. And the more I watched it, the more I understood something that made everything even clearer. She wasn't leaving because something went wrong. She was leaving because she believed something better existed. And that belief was based on what she thought I was worth. Not who I was. What I represented. And in her eyes, I represented limitation. That was the real truth. Not the words she said. Not the explanation she gave. The perception she held. Because perception drives decisions. And her perception of me was already fixed. The irony was, at the same time all of this was happening, my life was moving in a completely different direction. Quietly. Strategically. Without her knowing. Meetings. Calls. Documents. Finalizing details that had taken years to put together. The land deal wasn't just an opportunity, it was a turning point. 100 acres in a location that wasn't just valuable, but positioned for massive growth. The kind of move that doesn't just improve your situation, it redefines it. But I didn't tell her. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted to see something clearly. Who she was without knowing. Because once someone knows your value, their behavior changes. But that change isn't real. What's real is how they act when they think you have nothing. And I had already seen that. Fully. One night, as she was packing another box, she paused for a moment, like something had crossed her mind. "I hope you'll be okay," she said. And that sentence carried something different. Not concern. Not regret. Just distance. "I will be," I replied. And I meant it. Not because I needed to convince her. Because I already knew. She nodded slightly, like something had been confirmed for her. And then she continued packing. No hesitation. No second thoughts. No looking back. And as I stood there watching that moment unfold, I realized something that removed the last piece of doubt I had. This wasn't about losing her. It was about understanding her. Because now there was nothing left to question. Nothing left to interpret. Nothing left to guess. She had shown me exactly who she was in the version of reality she believed in. And that version didn't include me. At least not the version of me she thought existed. And that difference was everything. Because the man she was walking away from was already gone. She just didn't know it yet. And when she did, it wouldn't change what she had done. It would only show her what she lost. And by then, it would be too late. There's a point where everything stops feeling uncertain and starts feeling inevitable. Not because something dramatic happens, but because all the small pieces finally come together in a way that makes sense. That's where I was now. Not waiting, not hoping, not questioning. Just moving forward with a clarity I hadn't had before. The apartment felt different after she started packing seriously. Not emptier, but clearer. Like everything unnecessary was slowly being removed, leaving behind only what mattered. And the more space there was, the more I realized something important. This place had never been about us. It had just been a shared location for two people moving in different directions without fully realizing it. She continued with her routine, but it was no longer connected to me in any way. Her conversations became more focused on what was next for her. New plans. New possibilities. New environments. She spoke about them casually, like she was already living in that version of her life. And in a way she was. Because mentally she had already transitioned out of this one. "I found a place," she said one afternoon, standing near the door with her phone in hand. "That was quick," I replied. "It's better this way," she said. Better. That word carried the same meaning as everything else she had been saying, just packaged differently. "Yeah," I said. "It is." There was no tension in that moment. No conflict. Just alignment. Because at this point we weren't disagreeing anymore. We were simply acknowledging what had already happened. She started moving her things out piece by piece. Not rushing, not delaying, just following through on something that had already been decided. And with every box that left the apartment, something else became more obvious. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't reversible. This was complete. At the same time, my days started filling with something entirely different. Meetings that used to feel distant now felt immediate. Conversations that once carried uncertainty now carried direction. The land deal wasn't just an idea anymore. It was active, structured, moving. Engineers, planners, investors. People who spoke in terms of long-term value, not short-term perception. And for the first time, I wasn't explaining anything. I was deciding. 100 acres doesn't just sit there. It evolves. It becomes something. And I was at the center of that process now, not as someone hoping for results, but as someone shaping them. The contrast between that world and what was happening at home was almost unreal. On one side, everything was expanding, growing, becoming more valuable with every decision. On the other side, something was ending, shrinking, closing itself off completely. And the strange part was, I didn't feel conflicted about it, because once clarity reaches a certain level, it removes the need for emotional struggle. One evening she came back to pick up more of her things. The apartment was quieter than usual, not because of absence but because of transition. She walked in, looked around briefly, like she was measuring how much of her was still left there. "I'll be done in a couple of days," she said. "Take your time," I replied. And again that calmness shifted something slightly. Not enough to change her actions, but enough to make her aware that something about this situation wasn't unfolding the way she expected. "You're really okay with all this?" she asked. It wasn't the first time she had asked something like that, but this time it felt different. Not like a question, more like a check. "I am," I said. And I meant it. Because being okay doesn't come from losing something. It comes from understanding it. She looked at me for a moment, like she was trying to find something in my expression. Something that would explain why I wasn't reacting the way she thought I should. But there was nothing for her to find. Not because I was hiding anything. Because there was nothing left to hide. "You're different," she said quietly. That sentence was the first honest observation she had made in a while. "Maybe I always was," I replied. And that line stayed between us for a second longer than everything else. Because it carried something deeper than the situation we were in. It carried truth. The next few days passed without much interaction. She finished moving her things, finalized her new place, and gradually removed herself from the life we had shared. And with every step she took forward, something else became clearer. She wasn't looking back. Not even once. Because from her perspective, there was nothing worth revisiting. And that made everything even more certain. Because when someone leaves like that, without hesitation, without doubt, without even a moment of pause, they've already convinced themselves that what's ahead is better. And that belief is what drives everything. At the same time, my world continued expanding in ways she couldn't see. Contracts being finalized. Plans being drawn. Discussions about infrastructure, zoning, future developments. Conversations that didn't revolve around what I had, but what I was building. And that difference mattered. Because what she saw was a man without visible results. But what existed was something far beyond that. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documents at a cafe, my phone buzzed. A message from one of the developers involved in the project. "Everything is locked in. We're officially moving forward." Simple, direct, final. I read it once, then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I recognized what it meant. This wasn't potential anymore. This was reality. And in that moment, everything aligned. Not emotionally. Not dramatically. Just clearly. Because the version of me she walked away from was already gone. Replaced by something she never saw coming. That evening I returned to the apartment, now almost empty. The space looked different, but not incomplete. Just finished. Like something had served its purpose and reached its natural end. She had taken everything that belonged to her. But what she left behind was more valuable than anything she took. Clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because now there was nothing left to wait for. Nothing left to observe. Nothing left to understand. The only thing left was what would happen when our worlds crossed again. Because they would. Not by chance, but by reality. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be about explanation. It would be about realization. Because the life she chose to walk toward, and the life she chose to walk away from, were about to become impossible to ignore. And when that happened, everything she believed would be tested. Not by me. By truth. There's a strange kind of symmetry in life. The way moments circle back, not to repeat themselves, but to reveal something you didn't fully understand the first time. That's what this felt like. Not coincidence. Not chance. Just timing aligning in a way that couldn't be ignored. By the time she had fully moved out, the apartment had settled into something new. Not empty. Not quiet in a heavy way. Just complete. Like everything that needed to end had ended, and everything that needed to begin was already in motion. I wasn't thinking about her anymore. Not in the way people expect. There was no replaying conversations, no imagining different outcomes, no questioning what could have been. That phase had passed the moment clarity replaced uncertainty. My days were structured now. Meetings, site visits, conversations that carried weight instead of speculation. The land, those 100 acres, was no longer just a deal on paper. It was active, alive. Survey teams moving through the space marking boundaries. Engineers discussing layouts. Investors speaking in numbers that didn't just represent money but direction, growth, expansion. And somewhere in the middle of all that movement, something inevitable happened. Our worlds crossed again. Not planned. Not forced. Just aligned. I was at one of the development sites that afternoon, standing near the edge of the property where the land stretched further than the eye could comfortably take in. It wasn't flashy. Not yet. No buildings. No structures. Just open space marked with intention. But that's what made it powerful. It wasn't what it looked like now. It was what it was about to become. That's when I saw her. At first it didn't register. Not because I didn't recognize her, but because my mind didn't expect her to exist in this environment. She was standing a short distance away talking to someone I recognized from one of the consulting teams. Her posture was the same. Confident. Composed. But something about her energy felt different. Less certain. Less anchored. Then she turned. And our eyes met. For a second, neither of us moved. Not out of hesitation. Out of recognition. Because this wasn't the same situation anymore. This wasn't the same dynamic. This wasn't the same version of either of us. She took a step forward first, slower than usual, like she was processing what she was seeing while moving toward it. "I didn't know you were involved in this," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Not emotion. Not yet. Just adjustment. "I am," I replied. Simple. Clear. Controlled. She glanced around, taking in the space, the people, the activity. You could see the connection forming in her mind, piece by piece. The environment. The scale. The structure. It didn't match the version of me she had walked away from. "This is yours?" she asked. There it was. The question that carried everything. "Yes," I said. No explanation. No details. Just truth. And in that moment, everything shifted. Not externally. Internally. Because realization doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles. Quietly. But completely. She didn't speak for a few seconds. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because what she was understanding didn't align with what she had believed. And when those two things collide, there's always a pause. "I didn't know," she said finally. That sentence again. But this time, it meant something different. Because now it wasn't just information she didn't have. It was reality she had misjudged. "You didn't need to," I replied. And that line landed exactly where it needed to. Not harsh. Not emotional. Just accurate. She looked at me, really looked this time. Not the way she used to, not with assumption, not with quiet judgment. With awareness. Like she was trying to understand how she had missed something that now felt obvious. "When did this happen?" she asked. "It didn't just happen," I said. "It's been happening." And that was the truth. Because nothing about this was sudden. It was built. Over time. In silence. Without needing validation. Her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not enough for someone else to notice. But enough for me to see it clearly. Because I knew her. Or at least, I used to. "I thought," she started, then stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Because whatever she thought was already proven wrong. We stood there for a moment, not in silence, but in understanding. Not shared understanding. Separate understanding. Mine had been building for months. Hers had just arrived. "I guess I didn't see everything," she said. And that was the closest she had come to honesty since everything ended. "You saw what you believed," I replied. And that was the difference. Because people don't always see what's real. They see what aligns with their expectations. And her expectations had already made the decision. She nodded slightly, like something had settled inside her. Not fully. Not completely. But enough to recognize that something important had shifted. "This is big," she said, looking around again. "It is," I replied. No pride. No emphasis. Just acknowledgement. Because I didn't need her to validate it. I already knew. There was a pause after that, but this one felt different. Not empty. Not uncertain. Just complete in its own way. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I know," I replied. And that line carried everything. Because expectation was the entire reason we were standing here like this. She had expected one version of me and made her decision based on it. Now she was seeing another. And that changed everything. For her. Not for me. Because for me, everything had already changed before she walked away. I should go, she said finally. Not because she had somewhere to be. Because she didn't know where to stand in this moment. Take care, I said. And I meant it. Not out of attachment. Out of closure. She nodded once, then turned and walked away. And this time, I didn't watch her leave. Because there was nothing left to observe. Everything had already been revealed. Everything had already been understood. And as I stood there, looking out over the land that represented years of quiet work, one thing became completely clear. She didn't leave when I had nothing. She left when she thought I had nothing. And by the time she realized the truth, it was already too late. After that day at the site, nothing felt unfinished anymore. There were no lingering questions, no unresolved thoughts, no what-if scenarios waiting in the background. Everything had already played out exactly the way it needed to. Not because I forced it, not because I controlled it, but because truth has a way of revealing itself when you give it enough time. And now there was nothing left to figure out. The following days moved forward with a clarity I hadn't experienced before. My schedule was full but not overwhelming. Meetings had purpose. Conversations had direction. Every decision I made wasn't about catching up anymore, it was about expansion. The project was gaining momentum. Plans were being finalized. The land that once looked like empty space was now being mapped into something real, something structured, something that would soon carry visible value. But what surprised me the most wasn't the growth. It was the silence. Not the silence around me but the silence from her. After that encounter, I expected something. Not necessarily a conversation, not an apology, not even a reaction. Just something. But there was nothing. No calls. No messages. No attempts to reconnect. And at first I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because some realizations don't create immediate reactions. They build. Quietly. The same way everything else does. It was a few days later when my phone lit up with her name. I looked at it for a second, not with hesitation, not with curiosity, just awareness. Because I knew this moment would come. Not because of emotion but because of realization. And realization always seeks closure. I answered. Hello. There was a pause. Longer than usual. Not because she didn't know what to say. Because she was choosing how to say it. Hey, she said finally, and her voice carried something it didn't have before. Uncertainty. Not weakness. Not desperation. Just a shift. I've been thinking, she continued. That phrase again. But this time it meant something different. Not a decision. A reflection. I figured, I replied. Simple. Neutral. Controlled. Another pause followed, but this one felt heavier. Not uncomfortable. Just loaded with everything she was trying to process. I didn't understand things the way I should have, she said. And there it was. Not an apology. Not directly. But close enough to one. I see that now. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I needed time but because I didn't need to rush the moment. Because moments like this don't need to be filled with words. They need to be understood. What changed? I asked. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Just directly. She exhaled softly, like she had expected that question. Everything, she said. And that answer was honest. Because when perception shifts, everything connected to it shifts with it. I thought I knew where you were, she continued. I thought I understood what your future looked like. And now? I asked. I don't think I ever did. That was the closest she had come to complete honesty. Because the truth wasn't that she didn't know. It was that she decided without knowing. And now, she was dealing with that decision. I made a mistake, she said quietly. And that word, mistake, has a way of carrying more weight than anything else. Not because it changes what happened but because it acknowledges it. We all make decisions, I replied. And that line wasn't dismissive. It was accurate. Because this wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about timing. And timing is something you don't get back. I didn't think things would turn out like this, she said. I know, I replied. And again that line carried more than it needed to. Because expectation had been the foundation of everything. She expected one version of me. She acted on that expectation. And now she was facing the reality that didn't match it. I want to talk, she said. And this time, there was intention in her voice. Not urgency. Not desperation. Just desire to reconnect. Why? I asked. Because now reasons mattered. Not for me. For her. I think we ended things too quickly, she said. There it was. The attempt to reopen something that had already closed. I don't think we did, I replied. And that answer landed exactly where it needed to. Because the ending hadn't been rushed. It had been delayed. By everything we both ignored before it. I didn't see everything clearly, she added. That's true, I said. But you saw enough to decide. Silence followed. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Just acceptance. Because she knew that was the truth. I can't change what I did, she said. And that sentence was the most real thing she had said so far. No, I replied. You can't. Not harsh. Not cold. Just final. There was a shift in the air after that. Not something you could hear, not something you could see. Just something you could feel. Because at that moment she understood something completely. This wasn't a conversation about fixing anything. This was a conversation about accepting that nothing could be fixed. I just didn't think you were, she started then stopped. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Because whatever she didn't think had already been proven wrong. I know, I said. And that was enough. Because explanation wasn't necessary anymore. Everything had already been shown. I wish I had seen things differently, she said. And that line carried regret. Real regret. Not the kind that asks for something back. The kind that understands it's too late. Maybe, I replied. But you saw exactly what you believed. And that was the final truth. Because people don't act on reality. They act on perception. And her perception had already shaped everything. Another pause followed, longer this time. And then she said something that confirmed everything. I hope you find someone who understands you better. Not an attempt. Not a request. A release. And that's when I knew. This was the end. Not because we said it. Because we both understood it. You too, I replied. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about holding on to anything anymore. It was about moving forward. Completely. Without hesitation. Without attachment. Without looking back. After the call ended, I stood there for a moment, not thinking, not reflecting, just present. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left behind me that needed attention. Everything was ahead. Everything was clear. Everything was mine to build. And as I stepped forward into a future that had already begun before she walked away, one thing became completely certain. She didn't lose me when she asked for a divorce. She lost me when she decided my value without understanding it. And by the time she realized the truth, it was already too late. That was the closest she had come to complete honesty. Because the truth wasn't that she didn't know. It was that she decided without knowing. And now, she was dealing with that decision. I made a mistake, she said quietly. And that word, mistake, has a way of carrying more weight than anything else. Not because it changes what happened, but because it acknowledges it. We all make decisions, I replied. And that line wasn't dismissive. It was accurate. Because this wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about timing. And timing is something you don't get back. I didn't think things would turn out like this, she said. I know, I replied. And again that line carried more than it needed to. Because expectation had been the foundation of everything. She expected one version of me. She acted on that expectation. And now she was facing the reality that didn't match it. I want to talk, she said. And this time, there was intention in her voice. Not urgency. Not desperation. Just desire to reconnect. Why? I asked. Because now reasons mattered. Not for me. For her. I think we ended things too quickly, she said. There it was. The attempt to reopen something that had already closed. I don't think we did, I replied. And that answer landed exactly where it needed to. Because the ending hadn't been rushed. It had been delayed. By everything we both ignored before it. I didn't see everything clearly, she added. That's true, I said. But you saw enough to decide. Silence followed. Not defensive. Not argumentative. Just acceptance. Because she knew that was the truth. I can't change what I did, she said. And that sentence was the most real thing she had said so far. No, I replied. You can't. Not harsh. Not cold. Just final. There was a shift in the air after that. Not something you could hear, not something you could see. Just something you could feel. Because at that moment she understood something completely. This wasn't a conversation about fixing anything. This was a conversation about accepting that nothing could be fixed. I just didn't think you were, she started then stopped. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Because whatever she didn't think had already been proven wrong. I know, I said. And that was enough. Because explanation wasn't necessary anymore. Everything had already been shown. I wish I had seen things differently, she said. And that line carried regret. Real regret. Not the kind that asks for something back. The kind that understands it's too late. Maybe, I replied. But you saw exactly what you believed. And that was the final truth. Because people don't act on reality. They act on perception. And her perception had already shaped everything. Another pause followed, longer this time. And then she said something that confirmed everything. I hope you find someone who understands you better. Not an attempt. Not a request. A release. And that's when I knew. This was the end. Not because we said it. Because we both understood it. You too, I replied. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about holding on to anything anymore. It was about moving forward. Completely. Without hesitation. Without attachment. Without looking back. After the call ended, I stood there for a moment, not thinking, not reflecting, just present. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left behind me that needed attention. Everything was ahead. Everything was clear. Everything was mine to build. And as I stepped forward into a future that had already begun before she walked away, one thing became completely certain. She didn't lose me when she asked for a divorce. She lost me when she decided my value without understanding it. And by the time she realized the truth, it was already too late.